Hello everyone, welcome back to JP Study Corner. Today we are going to see Ministers List of India 2021. Prime Minister Narendra Modi expanded his cabinet to include 36 new faces. Here is the full list of cabinet ministers and ministers of state with their portfolios. Mr. Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of India. Portfolios: Prime Minister, Ministry of Personnel, Public Grievances and Pensions, Department of Atomic Energy, Department of Space, all important policy issues, all other unallocated portfolios. Mr. Amit Shah, Home Minister of India. Portfolios: Ministry of Home Affairs, Ministry of Cooperation. Mr. Rajnath Singh, Defence Minister of India. Portfolio: Ministry of Defence. Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman, Finance Minister of India. Portfolios: Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Corporative Affairs. Mr. Nitin Jairam Gadkari, Transport Minister of India. Portfolio: Minister of Road Transport and Highways. Mr. Narendra Singh Tomar, Portfolio: Minister of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare. Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, Portfolio: Minister of External Affairs. Mr. Arjun Munda, Portfolio: Minister of Tribal Affairs. Mrs. Smriti Subhain Irani, Portfolio: Minister of Women and Child Development. Mr. Piyush Goyal, Minister of Commerce and Industry. Portfolios: Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Ministry of Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution, Ministry of Textiles. Mr. Dharmendra Pradhan, Education Minister of India. Portfolios: Ministry of Education, Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship. Mr. Prahlad Joshi, Portfolios: Ministry of Parliamentary Affairs, Ministry of Coal and Ministry of Mines. Mr. Narayan Taturani, Portfolio: Minister of Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises. Mr. Sarbandana Sonowal, Portfolios: Ministry of Ports, Shipping and Waterways and Ministry of Ayush. Mr. Mukhtar Abbas Naqvi, Portfolio: Ministry of Minority Affairs. Mr. Virendra Kumar, Portfolio: Minister of Social Justice and Empowerment. Mr. Giriraj Singh, Minister of Rural Development. Portfolios: Ministry of Rural Development, Ministry of Panchayat Raj. Mr. Jyotiraditya Scindia, Ministry of Civil Aviation. Mr. Ramachandra Prasad Singh, Minister of Steel. Mr. Ashwini Vaishnav, Railway Minister of India. Portfolios: Ministry of Railways, Ministry of Communications, Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. Mr. Pasupati Kumar Paras, Portfolio: Minister of Food Processing Industries. Mr. Gajendra Singh Shekhawat, Portfolio: Minister of Jal Shakti. Mr. Kiran Rijiju, Portfolio: Minister of Law and Justice. Mr. Rajkumar Singh, Portfolios: Minister of Power, Minister of New and Renewable Energy. Mr. Hardeep Singh Puri, Portfolios: Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. Mr. Mansukh Mandavia, Health Minister of India. Portfolios: Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Ministry of Chemical and Fertilizers. Mr. Bhupender Yadav, Portfolios: Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Ministry of Labour and Employment. Mr. Mahendranath Pandey, Portfolios: Ministry of Heavy Industries. Mr. Parshottam Rupala, Portfolios: Ministry of Fisheries, Animal Husbandry and Dairying. Mr. G. Kishan Reddy, Portfolios: Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Development and North Eastern Region. Mr. Anurag Singh Thakur, Portfolios: Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports. Minister of State, Independent Charge. Mr. Rao Inderjit Singh, Portfolios: Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, Ministry of Planning. Minister of State Independent Charge, Dr. Jitendra Singh. Portfolios, Ministry of Science and Technology, Ministry of Earth Science. Minister of State, Mr. Rao Inderjit Singh. Portfolio, Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Minister of State, Dr. Jitendra Singh. Portfolios, Prime Minister Office, Ministry of Personnel, Public Grievances and Pensions, Department of Atomic Energy, Department of Space. Minister of State, Mr. Sripath Yeso Naik. Portfolios, Minister of Sports, Shipping and Waterways, Ministry of Tourism. Mr. Fahan Singh Kulaste. Portfolios, Ministry of Steel, Ministry of Rural Development. Minister of State, Mr. Prahlad Singh Patel. Portfolios, Ministry of Jal Shakti, Ministry of Food Processing Industries. Minister of State, Mr. Ashwini Kumar Chaubey. Portfolios, Ministry of Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Mr. Arjun Ram Mehwal, Minister of State. Portfolios, Ministry of Parliamentary Affairs, Ministry of Culture. Mr. V.K. Singh. Portfolios, Ministry of Road Transport and Highways, Ministry of Civil Aviation. Mr. Krishan Pal, Minister of State. Portfolios, Ministry of Power, Ministry of Heavy Industries. Mr. Danve Rao Sahib Dattatray. Portfolios, Ministry of Railways, Ministry of Coal, Ministry of Mines. Mr. Ramdas Atawali. Portfolios, Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. Minister of State Sadhvi Niranjan Jyoti. Portfolios, Ministry of Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution, Ministry of Rural Development. Minister of State Mr. Sanjeev Kumar Palyan. Portfolios, Ministry of Fisheries, Animal Husbandry and Dairying. Minister of State Mr. Nityanand Rai. Portfolios, Ministry of Home Affairs. Minister of State Mr. Pankaj Chaudhary. Portfolios, Ministry of Finance. Minister of State Mrs. Anupriya Singh Patel. Portfolios, Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Minister of State Professor S.P. Singh Bahal. Portfolios, Ministry of Law and Justice. Minister of State Mr. Rajiv Chandrasekhar. Portfolios, Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. Minister of State Sushri Shobha. Portfolios, Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare. Minister of State Mr. Banu Pratap Singh Verma. Portfolios, Ministry of Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises. Minister of State Srimati Darshana Vikram Jardosh. Portfolios, Ministry of Textile and Ministry of Railways. Minister of State Mr. V. Muralidharan. Portfolios, Ministry of External Affairs, Ministry of Parliamentary Affairs. Minister of State Mrs. Meenakshi Lekki. Portfolios, Ministry of External Affairs, Ministry of Culture. Minister of State Mr. Som Prakash. Portfolios, Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Minister of State Mrs. Renuka Singh Saruta. Portfolios, Ministry of Tribal Affairs. Minister of State Mr. Rameshwar Teli. Portfolios, Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, Ministry of Labour and Employment. Minister of State Mr. Kailas Chaudhary. Portfolios, Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare. Minister of State Mrs. Annapurna Devi. Portfolios, Ministry of Education. Minister of State Mr. A. Narayan Swamy. Portfolios, Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. Mr. Kaushal Kishore. Portfolios, Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. Minister of State Mr. Ajay Bhatt. Portfolios, Ministry of Defence, Ministry of Tourism. Minister of State Mr. B. L. Verma. Portfolios, Ministry of Development of North Eastern Region, Ministry of Cooperation. Minister of State Mr. Ajay Kumar. Portfolios, Ministry of Home Affairs. Minister of State Mr. Devu Singh Chauhan. Portfolios, Ministry of Communication. Minister of State Mr. Bhagwant Kuba, portfolios Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, Ministry of Chemical and Fertilizers. Minister of State Mr. Kapil Moreshwar Patil, portfolios Ministry of Panchayat Raj. Minister of State Sushri Pratima Paumik, portfolios Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. Minister of State Mr. Subhas Sarkar, portfolios Ministry of Education. Minister of State Dr. Bhagavat Kishan Rao, portfolios Ministry of Finance. Minister of State Dr. Rajkumar Ranjan Singh, portfolios Ministry of External Affairs, Ministry of Education. Minister of State Dr. Bharati Pravin Pawar, portfolios Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Minister of State Mr. Bisweshwar Tudu, portfolios Ministry of Tribal Affairs, Ministry of Jal Shakti. Minister of State Santanu Thakur, portfolios Minister of Ports, Shipping and Waterways. Minister of State Dr. Munchapara Mahendra Bai, portfolios Ministry of Women and Child Development, Ministry of Ayush. Minister of State Mr. John Parla, portfolios Ministry of Minority Affairs. Minister of State Dr. L. Murugan, portfolios Ministry of Fisheries, Animal Husbandry and Dairying, Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. Minister of State Mr. Nitish Pramanik, portfolios Ministry of Home Affairs, Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports. Hope this video very useful for you. If you feel the same, please like and comment and don't forget to subscribe my channel for more videos. Thank you.